What happens when the most feared woman on Bay Street is ordered to marry a Scarborough handyman who patches boilers for $20 an hour, only to discover the man covered in grease is the most powerful financier alive? Meredith Ashby had built Ashby Capital Group from a mid-market fund with 38 employees into a $40 billion private equity empire that made pension boards in 3 countries nervous just by filing its quarterly reports. At 38, she was the youngest managing partner in the firm's history, the first woman to chair the Bay Street Consortium, and the last person anyone expected to receive a marriage ultimatum over the telephone. She had sacrificed her social life, her 30s, and 2 relationships that had never stood a chance against her calendar. She had not done all of that to become someone's arrangement. But Alistair Ashby was 83 and running out of patience, and he had never once in his life issued a threat he did not intend to keep. The boardroom occupied the 31st floor of First Canadian Place, and on that particular Tuesday morning in November, it smelled of filtered air and controlled tension. Meredith stood at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer, scrolling through Whitfield Capital's most recent proxy filings with the expression of someone counting down to detonation. "He's sitting at 14%, her CFO said, sliding a folder across the mahogany. "If Whitfield reaches 30, he can force a special shareholder meeting if he reaches the trust's threshold." "He won't reach the trust's threshold," Meredith said without looking up. "Liquidate the Prairie's portfolio underperformers. Use the proceeds to buy back our own shares. I want a wall around this company by Thursday." She dismissed the meeting without ceremony and walked directly to her private office, where her phone was already ringing. "Grandfather," she answered, her voice losing one precise degree of its usual frost. "My study." Alistair's voice was the sound of granite being quarried. "Tonight." The Ashby estate sat at the end of a long private drive in Rosedale, shielded from the street by oak trees that had been growing since before most of Bay Street existed. Meredith arrived at 7 and found her grandfather in his leather chair by the fireplace, surrounded by first editions and decades of accumulated authority. An oxygen concentrator hummed quietly beside him. "You're losing ground," Alistair said without preamble. "Whitfield has the appetite and he's patient. The board is starting to murmur about stability. They want to see the Ashby name anchored to something more than one woman's ambition. I have tripled our net asset value in. I hold 52% of the voting shares in the family trust," Alistair said, "and I intend to transfer them to you." Meredith went very still. "There is one condition." He reached into his desk and set a manila envelope on the surface between them. 31 years ago, a man named Raymond Burke pulled me out of a collapsed shaft in a copper mine outside Sudbury. I was down there for 11 hours. He stayed the entire time. I offered him a third of the firm. He refused. He said he had enough. Raymond Burke died 4 years ago in a construction accident in Edmonton. He left behind a son and a granddaughter. They are living in a basement apartment in Scarborough. The son is 34. His name is Lachlan. You will marry him. You will give his daughter safety and the protection of this family's name. In return, the trust is yours." Meredith stared at her grandfather for a long moment. "You cannot be serious." "The papers are signed and waiting." He tapped the envelope. "Marry Lachlan Burke within the month, or I transfer my shares to the highest bidder. Grant Whitfield has already made an offer." The silence in the study was absolute except for the low pulse of the oxygen concentrator. Meredith picked up the envelope. Where exactly in Scarborough? The address led her to a low-rise apartment building on Kingston Road, its brick faded to the color of old sand, its parking lot home to 3 cars with expired stickers and one very tired-looking pickup truck. Meredith stood on the cracked front walkway wearing a camel coat that probably cost more than the building's monthly maintenance budget. The buzzer for 1C was labeled Burke in handwriting that had not tried very hard. She pressed it. The man who came to the door was tall in the way that filled a door frame without trying. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a canvas work shirt open at the collar, and hands that had clearly just been wiped on a rag and were still not entirely clean. He looked at her with dark gray eyes that held no particular expression. He did not look impressed. He did not look intimidated. He just looked like someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something. "Lachlan Burke?" Meredith asked. "Depends who's asking." "Meredith Ashby." Something moved through his eyes, not surprise exactly, quiet recognition, as though he had been expecting this and was deciding how to receive it. Before he could answer, a small figure appeared at his elbow, 7 years old, with 2 uneven braids and a gap where her front tooth should have been, wearing a paint-covered sweatshirt that read "Toronto is good." She carried a stuffed moose with one antler repaired in electrical tape. "Dad," the girl said, looking at Meredith with frank curiosity, "is she from your work?" "Go finish your coloring, Sage." He said it gently, with a hand resting briefly on her shoulder, and she retreated without argument. He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door behind him. "Alastair called 2 days ago," he said. "I know why you're here." "Then I'll make it straightforward," Meredith said. "This is a transaction. You sign a prenuptial agreement. A monthly allowance of $45,000, deposited to an account in your name. Your daughter will be enrolled in the best school in the city. I'll have options for you by tomorrow morning. You attend a small number of public events with me, present as a reasonable husband, and stay out of the way of my work. When the terms of the trust transfer are satisfied, we reassess." Lachlan looked at her for an unreasonably long moment. "I don't want the allowance," he said. "Everyone." "I don't," he said, simply and without drama. "But Sage needs somewhere safe, somewhere that isn't this." He glanced at the hallway behind him, its peeling paint, its flickering fluorescent light. Something passed across his face for just a fraction of a second, something old and complicated and wholly unlike the handyman standing in front of her. Then it was gone. "If the school is real, and the security at your building is what I've read it is, I'll sign your contract." She filed away the phrase "what I've read it is" and extended her hand. "We have a deal, Mr. Burke." His grip was calm and exact, and he held it for precisely as long as necessary. The courthouse ceremony took 11 minutes. Lachlan wore a dark suit that fit well enough that Meredith briefly wondered where a Scarborough handyman had found it. She wore white because her stylist had insisted, and she had not had the energy to argue. Alastair's solicitor witnessed the signing and left without small talk. That evening, Lachlan and Sage moved into the east wing of Meredith's penthouse in Yorkville. The apartment was 4,000 square feet of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and Sage walked through it with her mouth open, her stuffed moose pressed to her chest. "There's a bathtub you could swim in, Dad," she announced. "Don't swim in the bathtub," Lachlan said. "It's for bathing," Meredith confirmed. "Obviously," said Sage, who did not look like she thought it was obvious. Meredith showed them the East Wing and delivered the terms of their cohabitation in the same tone she used for quarterly earnings calls. East Wing, West Wing, kitchen shared, no guests without notice, private chef, dinner at 7, no crossing paths after 9. Lachlan listened to all of it without comment and said, when she finished, "Thank you for the space," and went to help Sage unpack. For the first 3 weeks, they were precisely as agreed. 2 people who happened to share an address. Meredith worked 18-hour days, while Grant Whitfield continued his slow encirclement of the firm. 2 of her institutional investors were being quietly courted away. The pressure was relentless and invisible, the kind that doesn't show up in the papers, but shows up in the circles under your eyes. She began to notice things about Lachlan she had not expected to notice. He never touched the allowance. He rose at 5:30 every morning, made Sage's breakfast from scratch, packed her lunch in a metal container with her name written in marker, and walked her to the car that drove her to Branksome Hall. He spent much of the day on the building's terrace with a battered notebook and a plain tablet, and when his phone rang, a featureless handset that was clearly not the one she'd seen him use the first week, he always walked away from the windows to answer it. She told herself it was not her concern. The first sign came on a Wednesday. Meredith had been in negotiations for weeks with Caldwell Developments, a Vancouver-based commercial property group whose portfolio she needed to complete a western expansion. The deal had collapsed on Monday. Their CEO had pulled out suddenly, citing strategic realignment, which was a phrase that meant Whitfield had gotten there first. She'd come home at 11:30 and found the kitchen dark except for the light above the stove, where Lachlan had left half a pot of soup with a lid on it and a sticky note that said from this morning, "Still good if you heat it." She had not eaten it. She had poured a glass of water and gone to bed. Thursday morning, her phone rang at 6:45. It was her head of acquisitions. Caldwell called. They want to restart negotiations. Talking exclusivity now. The CEO is citing, and I quote, "a reassessment of long-term strategic alignment." Meredith stood in her kitchen in her robe, staring out at the November skyline. "What changed?" she asked. "We don't know. He just reversed completely. Yesterday he wouldn't return my calls." She hung up slowly. She looked at the soup still sitting on the stove. Then she looked at the terrace, where Lachlan was already outside despite the cold, his notebook open, the plain handset at his ear. It was a coincidence, it had to be. The annual Ashby Capital Winter Gala was held at the Shangri-La on University Avenue, the one evening of the year when every significant power player on Bay Street gathered in the same room and pretended to like each other. Meredith had arranged a suit for Lachlan, dark charcoal, made by a King Street tailor she used for client events. When he appeared from the East Wing that evening, she experienced a moment she could not entirely account for. The suit had been cut for someone tall with broad shoulders and a certain bearing, and Lachlan had all three. With his hair combed and the expression of quiet containment he always wore, he did not look like a handyman. He looked like someone who made large, unhurried decisions in rooms with very good acoustics. It unnerved her. "Don't engage Whitfield if he approaches," she said in the elevator, going down. "He wants to prove to the board that I've lost my judgment." "I'll be fine," Lachlan said. "You don't know Grant Whitfield." "I know the type." The ballroom glittered in the particular aggressive way of events that cost a great deal of money to look effortless. The moment they entered, the room recalibrated. Heads turned. Meredith heard fragments. "That's him? He does clean up, I'll give him that," and kept her chin level and her arm steady through Lachlan's. His pulse, which she could feel against her forearm, was slow and even. It was a strange thing to notice. It was stranger that it was slower than hers. Grant Whitfield arrived at their side 40 minutes into the evening, holding a glass of scotch and wearing the expression of a man who had already won. "Meredith." He kissed the air near her cheek. "You look extraordinary, though your taste in company has become rather more rustic this year." His gaze slid to Lachlan with deliberate dismissal. "You must be the lucky man. I hear you do maintenance work. Tell me, do you know much about infrastructure bonds? Or is it mostly boilers and burst pipes?" The people nearby had gone quiet in the way of those pretending not to listen. Lachlan looked at Whitfield the way he looked at everything. Steadily, without urgency, with those gray eyes that seemed to be measuring distances most people couldn't see. "I know a little about infrastructure bonds," he said. His voice was unhurried. "I also know that your Kingsbridge Toll Road project in Hamilton is carrying 47% more debt than you've disclosed to your limited partners. I know the Ontario Securities Commission opened a preliminary file on Whitfield Capital in September, which you forestalled with a very expensive QC from a firm on Adelaide Street. And I know," he continued, his voice dropping to something barely above conversational but carrying the weight of a door being locked from the inside, "that the counterparty on your margin calls last Tuesday was a name your compliance team has never been able to fully document." Whitfield had gone the color of old wax, his glass tilted in his hand. "Where did you?" he started. "The soup was good, by the way," Lachlan said, turning back to the room. "Have you tried the soup at these things? Usually terrible. This one's decent." It took Meredith a moment to realize he was talking to her. Whitfield withdrew. Not gracefully. There was nothing graceful about a large man with a reputation trying to disappear sideways through a ballroom crowd, but thoroughly. He did not approach them again. Meredith pulled Lachlan behind a pillar near the bar. What was that? Small talk. Grant Whitfield is not small talk. He looked like he needed a cardiologist. How do you know about the OSC file? That hasn't been made public. My own intelligence division has been trying to confirm it for weeks. Lachlan looked at her. For the first time since they had met, the steady, contained expression shifted. Not much, just enough for her to see, very briefly, that there were rooms behind it. I follow the markets, he said. Handymen don't follow OSC preliminary filings on private capital firms. Some do, he said, and picked up 2 glasses of sparkling water from a passing tray and handed her one. That night she sat at her desk until 2 in the morning, running searches she could not quite articulate, and finding edges she could not quite grasp. She called her head of intelligence. Philippa called back the next morning, sounding like she had spent the day in a mine. I can't find the edges of him, Philippa said. The Scarborough life is coherent, confirmed it 3 ways. But anything before 4 years ago has been professionally removed. Not scrubbed, removed. When I started following the thread backward through the estate filing, my workstation caught something. It killed my external network access for 40 minutes and left a log entry in a server in Luxembourg my tech lead says he has never seen before. A pause. He's not what he looks like, Meredith. Beyond that, I genuinely cannot tell you. The Caldwell deal closed the following week at terms more favorable than Meredith had originally proposed. She had not pushed for those terms. She had not needed to. The counterparty had simply offered them. She stopped telling herself it was a coincidence. The answer came on a Sunday morning when it was 32 below with the wind chill, and Sage had declared that the day required pancakes with blueberries and absolutely no work. Meredith had come into the kitchen intending to get coffee and leave, and had instead been handed a spatula by a 7-year-old in moose-patterned pajamas and told she was on blueberry duty. She was still standing there, spatula in hand, genuinely uncertain how this had happened, when her phone rang. It was her head of security. Mrs. Ashby. The composure in his voice had been stripped clean. Whitfield's position collapsed overnight. His margin calls hit simultaneously across 4 funds. He's being forced into emergency liquidation. We've had a report from your building management that 2 men attempted to access the service entrance this morning with credentials that don't exist in our system. We've locked down the building, but... Sage, Meredith said. She turned. Lachlan was already in the kitchen doorway, his plain handset in his hand. He had heard everything he needed to from her face. Sage, sweetheart. His voice was steady and warm. We're going to play the quiet game in the big silver room. You can bring Mr. Moose. Is it a hide-and-seek kind of quiet game? Sage asked. Exactly that kind. He brought them to the reinforced safe room built into the building's core, hidden behind a panel in the utility corridor. He settled Sage inside with her stuffed moose and the bowl of blueberries, which she held with great seriousness. He looked at Meredith. Lock it, he said. Don't open it until I say Rideau. Lachlan. The door sealed. Through the viewport, she watched what happened next, and she would spend a long time afterward trying to find adequate language for it. 2 men came through the emergency stairwell, moving like people who had done difficult things in difficult places. Lachlan moved like someone who had been waiting for them. It was not a fight in any way she recognized. It was surgical and quiet and lasted less than a minute. When it was over, both men were on the floor, and Lachlan was standing in the center of the room, entirely unhurried, already on the plain handset. He said 3 sentences. 4 men appeared from the stairwell within 5 minutes, moving with the precision of people who answered to somebody significant. A composed man with silver hair directed them through the space with the manner of a career diplomat. Lachlan tapped on the viewport, Rideau. Meredith opened the door. Sage had fallen asleep against the wall with Mr. Moose tucked under her chin, apparently untroubled by the entire situation. The silver-haired man appeared at Lachlan's side and, without being asked, gently carried Sage toward the east wing. When he was gone, Meredith and Lachlan stood in the hallway. "My name is not Lachlan Burke," he said. The voice was the same, but something had left it. The maintenance worker, the careful flatness, the layer he had worn for 4 years. What was underneath was quieter and significantly more dangerous. "My name is Lachlan Beaumont." The floor seemed to tilt. Northgate Holdings had no public profile, no filing address, no executive team that had ever been photographed. It was the largest private infrastructure fund operating in the Commonwealth, believed to hold sovereign debt positions on 4 continents, rumored to be worth somewhere between $300 and $400 billion, depending on which analyst you believed. And it was run by a figure referred to in financial circles only as the Beaumont account. A name whispered the way serious people whisper things they cannot confirm and cannot entirely discount. It made institutions like Ashby Capital look like a promising community credit union. "The Beaumont account," Meredith said. Her voice was not as steady as she intended. "Yes. You own the debt on the 407, she said. "You hold a stake in Trans Mountain. You could," she stopped, "you could buy the building we're standing in and not notice the transaction." "Probably." "Then why," she said, "were you living in a basement apartment in Scarborough fixing boilers?" When he spoke, his voice carried something that had not been there before. Not weakness, but the particular weight of a grief that had learned to carry itself quietly. 4 years ago, a European consortium I held a debt claim against attempted to resolve the matter directly. They missed me. They found my wife's car instead. He paused. Delia was driving home from a conference in Calgary. The RCMP called it an accident. It wasn't. Meredith pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. They knew I would surface and come for them, and they knew Sage was the only leverage they had left, so I erased myself. Northgate continued operating through intermediaries, through Archer there. He nodded toward the hallway. And Lachlan Beaumont became a maintenance contractor in Scarborough who nobody looked at twice. He glanced at her, until Alastair offered a rather elegant alternative. "Alastair knew," Meredith said, "the whole time. Alastair has known who I am since I was 12 years old. My father told him everything before he died. When Alastair learned the consortium had begun narrowing their search to Toronto, he called me. He said he had a solution." Something close to private amusement crossed his face. He said there was no more effective place for an invisible man to hide than directly beside the most watched woman on Bay Street. Meredith absorbed this. The pieces rearranged themselves with the cold clarity of a spreadsheet correcting a data input error. The marriage, the insistence, choice of her, specifically. Her grandfather had not been protecting only the company. He had been protecting both of them and trusting them to eventually understand each other well enough to make it real. "The consortium," she said, "dismantled this morning. Archer confirmed it 40 minutes ago. Their accounts have been frozen. The people responsible for Delia's death will be in front of a court before spring." He said it with no particular heat, only certainty. Grant Whitfield, the morning news cycle eventually reported, had been brought in for voluntary questioning by the Ontario Securities Commission at 7 a.m. By noon, the preliminary inquiry had become a formal investigation. By 3 in the afternoon, 3 of his major backers had issued public statements distancing themselves from his firm. By 5 o'clock, Whitfield Capital Partners had announced an emergency suspension of operations pending compliance review. Meredith and Lachlan did not need a boardroom for the resolution. It happened in the city's financial record, line by line, the way large and real collapses always do, quietly, and then all at once. Alastair called that evening. He did not ask how they were. He said, "Good," and then, "I trust the arrangement is becoming less of an arrangement," and hung up before either of them could answer. A week later, Meredith came home to find Lachlan at the kitchen island, the prenuptial agreement on the counter in front of him. Sage was asleep in the east wing. The city was dark beyond the windows, except for the scattered light of a million lives being quietly lived. She sat down across from him. "The consortium is gone," she said. "You don't need the cover anymore." "No," he agreed. "Sage is safe. The threat is resolved. So the terms of the arrangement are satisfied." She looked at the document. "You and Sage are free too." "I rebuilt myself after Delia," he said, not loudly, but in a way that stopped her. "I made myself into someone no one could find or threaten or use. I was very successful at it." He looked at the prenuptial agreement. "I was also very alone. And Sage was growing up watching me pretend that was all right." He picked up the document and tore it in two. Not dramatically, but evenly, the way a man deals with something that no longer applies. "I haven't eaten a hot meal I wanted to eat in 4 years. I haven't sat in a room that felt like somewhere I intended to be. Until—" He stopped. Started again. "The morning Whitfield's men came, you stepped in front of my daughter before you thought about what you were doing. You just moved. You didn't calculate it." Meredith remembered she hadn't. "I don't want to be your contract," he said. "I want to be your family, if that's something you're willing to entertain." Meredith had negotiated the terms of large and complicated things for her entire adult life. She had always known exactly what she wanted from a conversation before she entered it. She had no idea what to say, and said it anyway. "I ate the soup," she told him, "2 nights ago. I heated it on the stove at midnight. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to give you the satisfaction." He looked at her for a moment, then the expression that was always held so carefully in his gray eyes, that particular combination of control and something much warmer beneath it, finally let itself through. "Was it good?" he asked. "It was adequate," she said. "That's the best review I've ever received," he said, and laughed, a real one, unguarded, and it changed the shape of the room entirely. She found herself smiling before she decided to. He made soup at midnight, and she stayed in the kitchen, sitting on the counter with her heels off for the first time in as long as she could remember. And they talked about nothing consequential for 2 hours, while the city went quiet below them, and Sage slept soundly in the east wing with Mr. Moose, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, the arrangement became something else entirely. 6 months later, the Ashby Capital Annual General Meeting opened with a presentation that made 3 analysts from competing firms quietly reconsider their career choices. The merger of Ashby Capital's operational platform with Northgate Holdings' capital infrastructure had produced a combined entity whose reach was, by any reasonable measure, historic. The AGM attendance was at record levels. The financial press had run out of superlatives. Lachlan arrived late, which he had promised not to do. He came in through the side door while Meredith was mid-sentence at the podium, Sage on his shoulders wearing a blazer that matched her mother's, and clutching Mr. Moose and a folder she had labeled, in careful 8-year-old letters, "My Investments." Meredith paused. She looked at her husband. She looked at her daughter, who waved from her considerable elevation, and mouthed something that appeared to be sorry we're late. There was soup. Several members of the board, who had not previously seen this family in a room together, experienced a private recalibration. "As I was saying," Meredith continued, returning to the room with a composure that had, for one visible moment, softened at the edges into something far better than composure. "The combined entity's long-term capital position is without precedent in the Canadian market, and we intend to be very deliberate with what we build from here." She looked, briefly and wholly, at the man settling into a seat near the door with their daughter on his knee and a thermos of coffee he had apparently brought from home. "We have every intention of getting this right." That much, at least, was no longer in question.